Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to Profiling Evil Live. I'm Mike King, and really appreciate you taking time to join us tonight. This has been a tough couple of weeks for a whole bunch of people, and just reading even the comments as we were getting started here tonight, I can see that it is an emotionally charged issue for many of you, and rightly so. I mean, this with Harmony Montgomery today, with the boys in the Doerman family, this stuff just seems to continue to repeat itself over and again. So we're going to try to take a little different route than the sensationalism and the emotional approach. We'll obviously have to talk about some of that, but I wanted to just spend a little time and talk about some of the characteristics of this type of a killer, and maybe answer some questions along the way. So please ask questions. I have my glasses here so that I can. I won't even need them, it looks like, so I can see what the questions are, and we'll pause from time to time. Like you might be accustomed, I have recorded some of this, and that way I can kind of keep my thoughts a little more concise. And so, without a whole lot of ado, I'm going to jump into that and say hello to everybody who's here. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for our mods who are here and watching over things. And folks, this one is this is a tough subject. Be kind to each other, and realize that there may be people on that are really struggling with this or with their own personal triggering as a result of this. So let's get started, and we'll pop in from time to time. And I want to just tell you up front, not associated with this case, but I have a special guest who may join us around 9:45 for a minute. He's up at the hospital with a family member, and hopefully we'll get away, and we were going to just chat about a couple things. And I want to shout out my buddy Duty Ron. I just was doing some cyber snooping on Ron's channel, listening to him talk about Harmony and with Michelle, and what a good job they did. And Ron, I didn't diss you when I was in New York City. I didn't have a moment's time, because I still want to go to Gilgo Beach and look at the Long Island serial killer with you. So we're gonna get together on that soon. Here, anyway, let's jump into this, folks. Well, hey, folks, little information's coming out about the father who executed his 3 small sons in Ohio a few days ago. And that lack of information is leading to the true crime community's speculation rather than waiting patiently for more information. But what's clear is that the local sheriff and the prosecutor say that the man, Chad Doerman, confessed. That declaration isn't answering the questions that many of you have emailed me about. What were the red flags? Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to Profiling Evil. This murder case has turned the true crime community upside down with emotion. How could it not? I mean, how does anybody justify taking the life of 3 small children? More importantly, why would a parent commit such a heinous act? You know, in this special edition, we're going to dig into some of the psychology of and the social demographic characteristics of parents who commit filicide. Filicide is the murder of children. Parents murdering children. So I hope you'll hit that like and subscribe button and ring the bell. You know, we're doing something that I generally keep for the boundaries of the Profiling Evil Academy. So I hope you'll consider signing up for one of our channel memberships. It's a place where you get a whole lot more instruction for just a little bit more. And your donation truly does help. So please consider it. Now, let's dig into this case of paternal filicide, paternal father filicide murder. Now, when news of this story broke last week, I was just pulling into a little piece of heaven that I have up in the mountains. I was working on repairing a section of fence that the snow had destroyed over the winter, and I was listening to the news on my AirPods. When this story came across, I was so overcome that I had to stop working and sit down under a shady tree while I surfed the internet in pursuit of more information. Once I got into that rabbit hole, it led me to releasing a video that now more than 120,000 of you have viewed, and I really appreciate you viewing that. You know the story, but I'm going to repeat a little bit of it as a refresher. Chad Doerman is the alleged killer. According to prosecution, the confessed alleged killer. He's a Monroe Township, Ohio resident, and he calmly admitted to responding police officers that he had planned the execution of his sons for months. Now, this is incredibly important, and I hope that you caught that. He planned on executing his 3 little boys months earlier. This wasn't a heat of passion, or it wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. This was, according to the reported confession, a planned event. This is so significant to me that I wanted to bring it out from the get-go and talk about it a little more in detail. This kind of planning doesn't happen without a requisite amount of anger, resentment, that I'll show you attitude, and frankly, absolute disregard for human life. The reason this is so dang important is because somebody doesn't just go from happy days where they're going to ball games in the park and all this other stuff, to planning the murder for months without some major red flags occurring. Things like domestic violence in the home, physical or perhaps even sexual abuse, spousal abuse. Now, these are based on my experience, and it shows that there are usually early indicators in these kinds of violent acts and opportunities. And albeit very uncomfortable opportunities, there are, as I said, in these kinds of violent acts, opportunities for intercession. You know, it's a place where, again, whether they're uncomfortable or not, we as family, friends, or acquaintances could have stepped in and notified authorities of the abuses that we're seeing going on or that we're perceiving. Now, I get that family members have already come out and said that this is not at all characteristic of this defendant. It's something that we always hear, right? I wonder, as this case progresses, though, if we're going to hear more that suggests that there were opportunities for early intervention, places where people could have interjected, maybe called someone like family services or law enforcement. Now, I say that trying not to be judgmental, but I want you to watch for indicators that support this theory, and I'm going to base my experiences and I'm going to base my thoughts on my own personal experiences. See, according to police reports, court records, and media reports, Doerman lined up his 3 little boys before executing them with a rifle. Now, when I saw the police body cam video panning past that rifle, it appeared to me that it's a very small caliber rifle. Certainly something like a 22. When I was a boy, you could have killed a deer with a 22 if you shot the animal in. Hey, folks, I want to just pause there for a minute to kind of reemphasize this as we're going through this. And I am reading your comments, and I appreciate your comments. I'll try to pull out from time to time, and we'll talk about some of those. But again, I thought this was really interesting. This is kind of a small little gun to shoot squirrels or to target practice or things like that. And if you look at that little silver clip that's hanging down just below the strap on the police officer's gun, you can see again how small that is. And I don't know if it's significant or not, but to me it was significant and something that I picked out. it wasn't necessarily significant to me that the weapon's pointing in the direction that it's pointing. I'm going to be interested to see if this guy is left-handed or right-handed, because the positioning of the gun would suggest more that he's left-handed. And I know that one of his sons, according to one of the media reports, was a little left-handed pitcher. And again, how important that is or unimportant it isn't. One thing that's kind of interesting is if he is in fact left-handed, um, then it presents an interesting situation for him with the ejection of the rounds in a weapon like this. But again, how important? Heck, I don't know. And I'll look for your comments as we go along, but we'll jump right back into this. The head, for instance. But a 22 bullet is not going to cause immediate death unless the children were hit somewhere like in the head. That's kind of a disgusting thing to talk about, but I think it's kind of significant that he used a 22. I'm not sure why. Maybe he didn't have any other weapons, and that was the one he chose. I don't know. Now, it may have been during the exchange that when his wife comes in and tries to stop him from shooting the boys, she gets shot in the hand. And it may have been at this point that one of the boys flees the scene attempting to escape what he knows is going to happen. Well, like a rabid dog, his father pursued him and captured him, drug him back to the scene of the other homicides, and then executed him in front of witnesses. And we haven't heard who those witnesses are, other than I suspect the mother, perhaps the daughter, and then who knows if we're going to learn of more. It may have been that the other boys were still alive and they witnessed it as well. Now, I think it's kind of interesting here. Craig Bush indicates that the boys were shot in the head execution style. And Craig, if you could put a link in the chat below where you're getting that. I haven't seen that piece of information, certainly not suggesting that that's not accurate. I just haven't heard that. And of course, you have to think about that from a behavioral standpoint, that if in fact that were the case, the boys would have to remain much more still in order to get that shot off. And they probably were lined up just as it's been indicated here. Again, and please forgive me, because I look at this thing from an investigator's perspective rather than maybe the emotional perspective. So please forgive me on that, folks, as we go along. But here, let's jump back in. All indications are that the boy's mother was the first person to make the 911 call requesting police, while at the same time, the daughter's running down the street and flags down a passing car reporting that her father is killing everybody in the family. That passerby dials 911, and within minutes, deputies had taken this accused killer into custody. The sad thing here, their resuscitation efforts failed, and all three boys are pronounced dead. Now, many of you, like me, have responded that Doerman appeared so calm, matter of fact, almost casual when police were taking him into custody. Did you catch that part when the officer said to him, "What's going on?" He replies, "Nothing." And then he makes sure that the officer knew that his dog, which was barking, wasn't dangerous. He seemed to show more concern for that dog than he did his very own children, the family that he had just executed. Well, Doerman's bail has now been set at $20 million. Initial court records didn't show who his attorney is, but you can be sure he's going to be represented, even if it's paid by the state, since this is undoubtedly going to be a capital death penalty case. Now, listen closely, because this may be a controversial discussion, and this is something that I find really interesting. I remembered reading, and I went back and did a little research. In March of this year, just a few months ago, Ohio's Attorney General, David Yost, he's been in there for a long time, characterized Ohio's capital punishment system as broken and enormously expensive. Yost called on his elected officials in the state to either overhaul the capital punishment system or end it altogether, arguing that the system just produces churn, waste, and endless lawsuits and nothing else. Well, I don't know about you, but I'm wondering if Yost is thinking today that he might have a little different opinion after what he just witnessed happening in his own state. I'd be really interested in your thoughts on this one. And I know that many of you question whether the death penalty has frankly outlived its time. But does a case like this cause you to maybe reflect on that opinion? Now, I'm not suggesting Yost is wrong, but I do find myself wondering that if Yost even is thinking at this moment in time, maybe we should wait and table that discussion until this particular case is adjudicated. So I want to stop right there. And hey, Ether Bunny, thank you so much for this kind super chat. It really is appreciated. And folks, feel free to donate if you'd like, or go over to our PayPal account or join our channel memberships. But Ether Bunny, thank you so much. So I think the thing that I was so intrigued with the fact that in March, Yost determined that the death penalty was kind of outdated and too expensive to pursue. I just want to look in the chat box here for a minute and see what your thoughts are about the death penalty when you're thinking about this particular case, because I know that many of you think, no, it's outlived its usefulness, or there ever was a usefulness. And then you start feeling the emotion of something like this, and sometimes people have a different opinion. So let's just see if anybody happens to weigh in that regard. And I'm not seeing. Well, there's Crystal saying, "Hey, firing squad would be perfect for this kind of a case." It kind of incenses all of us. Shaquille, this would be the perfect death penalty case, no doubt. Rocky Mountain woman says death penalty is still needed. Yeah, I think this is a really interesting, Leslie. Some people pick a position and they're not going to back off regardless. And so anyway, the kind of interesting. And thanks for sharing some of your comments on this. We'll jump back into this and catch a little more. Here's Debbie saying, "I'm not for death in any case," and thank you, Debbie. And I was reading ahead, Berlinda, death for sure. It's just a tough situation. Lisa, I'm not opposed to the death penalty, but I don't think it deters criminals. And that's exactly the point that Yost made. Ohio has their own problems. I mean, there are 120 people sitting on death row today. They, like in Idaho and other states, have paused their executions because they're having a hard time getting lethal injection drugs. Drugs like fentanyl that seems to be available through street sources, if you follow the Corey Richens case, and that's accurate. Now, the Ohio Attorney General also argued that capital murder cases are expensive, and he cites evidence that suggests that the death penalty doesn't deter crime. Well, what are your thoughts on this one, folks? I hope you'll put your comments down below. And as you're doing that, let's just kind of evolve a little bit and talk about the classification of fathers who murder their children. This phenomena of parents who kill their children is called filicide. And when a father commits the crime, it's called paternal father filicide, paternal filicide. So I'm going to pause there for a minute because, when I was putting this together, I thought, this isn't really an exciting, sensationalized presentation. So what are your thoughts when we really dig in and we talk about these crime classifications, and we try to look a little bit beyond the event, the crime, and try to understand a little more about what's going on? I'd love to know what your comments are. And Robin, thank you so much. Can you explain the difference between mental illness, psychosis, and psychopathy? Thank you for covering this case, man. You know what? I think what we'll do one night, Robin, is bring on a dear friend of mine, uh, and we'll, in fact, gosh, uh, I I have a friend who is a professor at Harvard, and I served under him in the program in psychiatry and the law at Harvard. And his name is Harold Burstein, and Harold could better describe this. I'm a street cop that tries to kind of keep these things in place, but the one thing that he always told me to kind of level set was that it's psychopathy and that it's behaviors that are outside of societal norms. And then I kind of let the experts argue back and forth about the individual pieces. So that's a really terrible answer, Robin, but the one that I'm most comfortable with based on my experience and expertise in this area. Let's jump back in. It was conducted several years ago. A group of 5 researchers studied 10 men who had murdered children, their children. They explored the psychiatric and the social demographic profiles of each of these killers to come up with a criminological assessment, or in other words, a profile or a classification. The study uncovered a number of situational factors that were going on before the men killed their children. Things like marital problems going on, separation, or financial problems. Now, most of the homicides that were committed were ultimately diagnosed with the killer having some type of disorder. I'd say that's an understatement. But their report said that 80% of killers were deemed to have personality disorders, and 40% had a psychotic symptom of some kind at the time of offense. And this is why I think it's so important to take Doerman's confession that he had been planning the murders for months into consideration. His psychotic symptom didn't appear just moments before he killed his children. Now, the experts concluded that many factors are involved in the dynamics of filicide situations, and that makes them really difficult to predict. But all of the mental health professionals agree that if a man is verbalizing delusional ideas about his child, children, or spouse, and I'd like to add anyone, somebody should be demanding protection or help or some kind of intervention. And I'm going to talk about what a neighbor had to say about this guy in just a minute, but I remembered listening to a presentation by the National Institute of Justice on the topic of why men kill. In one particular segment, David Adams, a guy who wrote a book called Why Do They Kill, spoke about some of the controlling behaviors exhibited by men before they commit these murders against their children. I went out and I dug up that old presentation, and I wanted to play a few clips from it for you to consider and hopefully learn from. I found one portion of that discussion to be very important, and it causes me to think more about Doerman wanting to punish his wife more than just simply wanting to kill his children. The kids may have merely been stage props in this fantasy revenge killing. I wonder if we'll learn that the Doerman wife was planning to leave the killer, and that is what motivated his actions in his sick mind to go out and kill his children. Now, I'm not placing blame on her. We're going to talk a little bit about that dynamic in a minute. But listen to this series of comments from David Adams.
So one of the questions I asked the killers, there were 14 of the killers in my study that used guns, and I was curious. I asked them, well, would you have used another weapon if a gun were not available? And as you can see from the slide, 11 of them said no. And the reasons they gave were that, I was intoxicated. One of them said I didn't have the strength to stab her, to choke her. Another one said, well, it happened so fast, I would have come to in the time it took to take out a knife. Another one said, a gun depersonalizes. I wouldn't have gone through with it if I'd had time to think about it. This man, a gun is an easier way. I didn't have the guts to use a knife. That's butchering. He is one of the killers that actually killed multiple people. He killed his wife, his wife's mother, as well as her sister. Kind of hid out on Easter Eve in their house. Broke into his estranged wife's house and basically hid out in the basement and sprung himself on them on Easter morning. And first tracked down the mother, his wife's mother, pointed the gun to her and said, "Die, bitch," before shooting her. Then tracked down her sister and shot and killed the sister, and then killed his wife. But this order was very significant because he'd really thought it through, and it really wanted her to first see her wife, and her mother, and her sister being killed first.
Now, many experts believe that most of these murders fit within a few classifications, including 35% of all those murders where the father killer commits what's called altruistic murders. Now, altruistic filicide murders are murders that are carried out with this idea of love, somehow to relieve the real or imagined suffering that the child is going through. These murders are sometimes associated with suicide, and it's going to be really interesting to learn more about Doerman and whether he intended to commit suicide after killing his family. Now, I want to pause there for a minute, just get some sense from you of this idea of altruistic filicide or altruistic homicide motivation, because it's really interesting when you think of different cases, and there are a number of them. Oftentimes it happens with moms rather than dads, that they believe that it is more compassionate to murder their children than to allow them to go with a abusive spouse or something else like that in a family that's breaking up. So we have to always consider, when you look at these cases, doesn't change the facts and the elements of the case that this individual took the life of another, but it does help us in understanding what the amount of responsibility should be in the court system. And so again, think about this idea of altruistic, and can you in any fashion, sense, or state think that there was motivation in his mind that he was saving his boys from something? We may see that come out in the trial as part of a defense. We may not. Personally, I don't believe it's an option in this case, but I want to see if there are any comments here. I'm not seeing anyone really commenting on that, so we'll just jump back into it. I'm also interested in learning if he ran out of ammunition, if his weapon jammed, or if there was some other explanation for his cessation of this murder spree. Perhaps he had a moment of sanity that might have caused him to stop and submit to an arrest, but I think there's something else that happened there. Now, it's difficult to determine what Doerman's motivation was, but we need to consider this altruistic classification as we look at the case. But frankly, I'm betting it has more to do with revenge than anything else. Now, experts report that fathers who commit spouse revenge murders end up killing their children in an attempt to make the spouse suffer, to punish the spouse. Often these cases result in extermination of the entire family once they accomplish this revenge killing in front of their intended target of anger. For instance, if that were the case, he may have tried to, or wanted to, or fantasized about killing the entire family. But first, if this is correct, it was all about punishing the mother by killing her children in front of her. So let's stop there for a second, because this one is a tough one for people to swallow. And yet I've seen it repeated so many times. There is so much anger and frustration, and it is all about first punishing that spouse. And so many times it then leads to others. Now, I saw some comments earlier about why did the stepdaughter, was she allowed to escape? or why wasn't the mother executed? And that takes me back to that original question that I had that you'll remember. I want to know why he stopped where he did. Did that weapon jam? Did he run out of bullets? Was there intent to go beyond? Are there manifestos that are going to give us more clarity? Those are the kinds of things that become really important in understanding the true overall motivation and the classification. And to Old Soul, thank you so much. Was he acting when he went to court? He seemed off in court, but calm during his arrest. You know what? It might have been the reality of what he did by the time he got to court. I don't know, but thanks so much for that kind donation. And let's see what we got going on here. Let's see. Yeah, a lot of you really troubled by the fact that he was so calm. Now, here, Crystal's saying she doesn't believe it was revenge motivated. It'd be interesting to what you think. D is saying, I think so. Here we go. I'm not sure what this question is, so I'm not going to comment on it, Strawberry Kisses, because I missed probably something that was communicated earlier in. Yeah, I mean, to me, it's looking more like there was some triggering series of events that maybe the marriage was in trouble. There was talk of divorce, or more importantly, talk of her leaving him and taking the kids. And of course, there's other things that come out that kind of support that kind of mindset that I think will come out in court as this thing goes along. But let's jump back in. Children as well. Now, here's something that you might find really interesting, and I certainly did. And that is that according to that study I was referencing, the average age of men who commit paternal filicide is 32 years old. That's the average age. Now, Chad Doerman is 32 years old. Now, studies suggest that fathers who kill their kids are usually separated or divorced. So it's going to be really interesting to see if Doerman's wife had recently filed for divorce or was threatening divorce. And statistically, fathers who kill their kids usually only have about a 10 and a half years of formal education. So they're somewhere between that sophomore and junior year in high school. And only 40% of those killers in that study had graduated from high school. Now, I believe that Doerman graduated from high school. 40% have criminal records, and Chad Doerman had one criminal case, an assault on his father, that I was able to find by searching with my partner Truth Finder. And you might check those guys out. There's a link down below, but I use them to do research on these cases as I'm looking at them. Now, the average age of paternal filicide victims is 5 years old. Chad Doerman's boys were ages 7, 4, and 3. Making their average age 4.6 years, close to that overall average, indicating that this is a period of time where children in these dysfunctional situations are at greatest risk. Think of the comment of that Claremont County prosecutor, David Gast, who said, he was their world, he was their guardian, and he executed them in cold blood. In fact, let's just watch that clip.
He was their world, he was their guardian, and he executed them in cold blood.
Now, some of you have commented that the mother should also be arrested or at least examined because she allowed her children to remain in this high-risk situation. Folks, I get the emotion and the emotional responses that we're seeing and you're feeling. But leaving a battered situation is much more difficult than maybe any of you may realize. And for those of you who have been through it, you might want to weigh in the comments section down below. But to highlight this, I want to turn to a comment by Dr. Jacqueline Campbell, who shared her thoughts during that same Men Who Kill symposium that I. Now, I want to stop there for a minute. And by the way, Karen, thanks so much for that super sticker. I really do appreciate that. This is a really important point because we become rather judgmental, I think, when we sit and do our armchair quarterbacking on these kinds of cases. And hopefully some of you might feel comfortable enough who have been in domestic violence situations to talk about this. But leaving is terribly difficult, not only because there's a little sense of fear of the unknown of how am I going to survive or what am I going to do, but it's also a fear of the escalation that occurs when someone is going through that process of leaving, and maybe even a fear. And frankly, that's what these predators bank on, is that the intimidation and fear is going to keep that person compliant and put up with them. But Dr. Campbell just knocks it out of the park with her explanation here. So I think I'll just go to that. But first, I want to grab this quick comment here from Lori, and thank you for sharing this, Lori. I tried multiple times to leave my abuser. It took 4 times before I actually could. I had to leave town and hide. I mean, just so tragic. And Lori and Hetty and others, I'd be interested in knowing, at what point did you finally contact police, and did police help? And holy cow, I sure hope that they did. Anyway, yeah, what bravery, Jen, and to all of you, thank you. Joanne, abusive men tell women they'll kill them or their kids if they try to leave. Yeah, the floodgates are opening up now. I hope you all don't mind me sharing this. Took 7 times literally to leave my ex-husband. Maurice says, yeah, it takes at least 7 times before they finally leave. I don't know if that's a bona fide statistic or where that comes from, but Jess, amen. Earlier. Now, I have a recording of Dr. Campbell talking about the risk women face when they finally say enough is enough. Let's listen.
Well, the first step in either of those cases, because oftentimes we do see intimate partners, male intimate partners, who are over-enmeshed. That's one way to describe them, as a type of batterer. Where we have noticed these before. They do sometimes escalate to a homicide. Homicide-suicide is relatively common. They are characterized by the phrase that you see all too often is, if I can't have you, no one can, which is partly a controlling kind of thing, but it's partly that over-enmeshment, that very dependent abuser who has, you can talk about it in terms of attachment theory. He has is very uncertain attachment, that his violence is usually only triggered when she attempts to distance herself in some way. And of course, the ultimate distancing would be when she was either talking about leaving him, and that's oftentimes that final scenario, and oftentimes we don't know that final scenario. But in some cases where it's an attempted homicide where she lives through it, that's oftentimes what women describe to us is I was talking to him about leaving him because he's been abusive. That was the discussion she had with him, rather than calling the police about the domestic violence or calling the National Domestic Violence Hotline or any kind of shelter services. So the number one kind of step here is to get women to disclose domestic violence, to get help, and to not necessarily make their first point of addressing this issue, although, a strong, resourceful way to go, and one that we oftentimes would applaud. She ought to just leave him, right? But the trouble is that may result in an immediate homicide right at that point in time. So what we need to do before we could ever use any kind of risk assessment is to get women to come forward when they are abused. And if they disclose, because the first people they usually disclose to is a family member or a friend about being abused, and for friends to help them get the kinds of services. We know that shelters are protective against women being hurt again. We know we have good resources. Now, that it's not always appealing to all women to go to a domestic violence shelter, but they can get help from the shelter services, from the hotline, from counseling, from support groups, without actually having to go to the shelter. So, that would be the first thing. Then, if they're part of shelter services, using something like the danger assessment, which helps her see for herself her risk of a homicide. So it's very much meant to be a tool that can be used with women, because they oftentimes do minimize the amount of danger in their situations. Then, as David said, the other way that can be very useful is to get an order of protection.
Well, you might find it interesting that most of the father-led murders occurred at the perpetrator's home. And in most cases, the father tried to commit suicide shortly after the offense. Now, most of the red flags that waved in these cases, part of this study that I'm talking about, involve things like financial challenges, a lost job, or losing a job, or quitting a job, or just other financial challenges, parenting challenges where maybe they're disagreeing on how the kids should be raised or disciplined, failing marriages, including all kinds of dynamics within failing marriages. But I find myself returning to this statement by the killer, the statement Chad Doerman made, that he'd been planning this murder for months. It caused me to reflect on Adam's book again. And his book, you ought to pick it up, is Why Do They Kill? It was really powerful. So I want you to listen to this powerful statement by David Adams that he brings out. Let's listen.
Well, the other thing that is a significant risk factor is threats, and that's why it is included in all of the danger assessment, the risk assessment tools, But just to sort of pick up on what Jackie was saying, it's I think we can't just over-rely on tools, because, we really do, and this is where the criminal justice system really needs to improve, is having a better manner, when talking to victims. I think sometimes the tools are used almost as a replacement, for trying to establish a rapport with victims. And so that shows up as a yes or no item. Has he threatened you on a danger assessment tool? But that doesn't really give you anywhere near enough information. What I found in interviewing the killers and interviewing the victims of attempted homicide is that the frequency of threats was very significant. The more frequently someone had threatened to kill his partner, the more he was separating himself from the pack, so to speak, and establishing his credentials to kill. The other interesting thing I found in talking to the killers is that quite a number of them said, the more I said it, the more real it became that I could actually do it. So that threats really seemed to serve two purposes. One was to obviously intimidate and scare a victim into submission, into remaining in a relationship, but also for the killer, for the perpetrator, to psych himself up. The words are very much rehearsals for actions, and so that it was interesting, to hear that mechanism, that many of them just using the words made them more likely. We're sort of testing it out, so to speak. In the same way that kind of the serial killers will, pick up a few hitchhikers before they kill their first one, or kill some animals before they will kind of work their way up to it, so to speak. And so that's very significant, and I think that's where, like in matter intervention programs, for instance, I think we can work very well with those types of people, because whether they're enmeshed or whether they're jealous, it really kind of amounts to the same thing, is that really they should have some sort of program that helps them to recognize that there is life beyond the relationship, too. And that's where really the work is, and that's a very kind of potentially life-saving issue for many of the victims. They feel stuck. They feel like he just doesn't accept that there's any viable life beyond the relationship, and I think that's where help programs can come in, is to say, to refocus them. Sometimes we get them refocused on their children, sometimes we get them refocused on other things in their lives, but just to sort of get them to a place where they can begin to recognize that life doesn't stop, that there is still life, viable life for you, even if this relationship ends.
Well, extended family members of the victim boys are painting a picture that this was just a fluke, that the boys were living in a happy home, in a happy life, and that all was well. Even that things were good and Doerman must have just simply snapped. Well, as more information comes out, I suspect we're going to see a much different picture painted. Perhaps not until the trial. But I wanted to reflect on something the neighbor said when he talked to reporters yesterday. He said that Doerman was always angry. Now, this neighbor said he witnessed the aftermath of the shooting and that he's seen Doerman treat both his wife and his children poorly. The guy's name is Richard Kincannon, and he was speaking to the press, and he said while talking about Doerman that he, quote, he was angry every day. There wasn't a day he didn't yell at his wife and kids out there, close quote. Now, look at the opposite end of the spectrum. His father, Doerman's father, suggested that there's no explanation for what happened, saying his son just snapped. Yet he also said he could tell that when he looked in his son's eyes that he was hollow inside. And he described his son after that initial appearance that he attended as it was somebody else. It wasn't Chad standing there. Frankly, he said, quote, it was not him, close quote. I guess meaning that he could tell something was really different. Well, folks, I've said this so many times, but in my opinion, domestic violence doesn't get better on its own. I really appreciated Adam's comment that there's something beyond the relationship that's better. I hope that you'll share that reality with anybody that you know who's going through a domestic violence relationship. It may even be that it's you that's going through this thing, and that you're in this position to make a life-changing, life-altering choice. I hope that you have the courage to do so. You might consider reaching out to law enforcement or your local prosecutor's office. You know, most states have a victims' rights office, and any of those places can help provide you with some insight and names of people that might be able to help. You know, I really also liked Adam's comment where he talked about the risk factors of this type of homicide. And I thought you might like to hear his comments, including those that teach us how children can become predators just like their aggressive parents. And this was a stark reminder to me of why it's so important that we intervene as soon as possible to prevent this cycle from continuing on. Keep in mind, folks, that predicting homicide is next to impossible. I mean, I don't believe that anybody can predict when a homicide is going to occur, other than maybe the actor who's getting ready to do it. But people with violent tendencies seem to be more likely to commit homicide than those who promote peace, those who promote understanding and inclusion. I also want to remind you that Adams found that the closer to the homicide event that the individual killer moved, the more they used threats, including specific threats that were uttered over and over again. It's almost their way of starting to test the waters and distance themselves and get the courage to pull this off.
Absolutely. On the specificity of threats, I found that as you got kind of closer and closer to the actual homicide or attempted homicide, threats had become not only more frequent, but more specific and more graphic as well. Yeah.
So in my opinion, it really boils down to intervention. I mean, sure, there are situational factors like the financial problem, the problem in relationships in the home, stress in the home, or even external stresses like from your job. There might be unfaithfulness in a marriage or illness that destroys this fantasy that a couple has about their future. But none of this justifies homicide or violent behavior. Now, some of you will make an argument about guns or gun controls as part of this discussion. Others are going to say it has all to do with trust and nothing else. Well, I think it has to do with this idea of these predators are trying to exhibit power, dominion, and gain some control in their life. I think they're narcissistic personalities that are only focused on themselves. You know, we have to become better at acknowledging that life can be hard. Marriage can be hard. Jobs can be crummy, and our finances might not be what we want. We have to realize that our fantasies are interfering in many cases with our realities, and we have to get better at asking for, and if asked, giving help. So I hope you'll share your thoughts down below, and more importantly, I hope you'll be kind to each other as you work through these challenges. And be kind to each other as you're working through the comments from your peers and the responses that you're going to pitch out for others to consider. This is a time for the true crime community to be coming together, in my opinion, to maybe better figure out how to be better, how to be more helpful, or how to be more understanding. It's also a time for great patience as we wait for more information on this case to come out. Now, if you're interested in donating to the family, there's been a GoFundMe set up that originally had a goal of $20,000 to help with funeral expenses. This thing has exploded, and I've watched it grow steadily for the past couple of days, with totals in today that are going well over $200,000. That's 10 times more than the family asked for. I'm only saying that because I don't want to discourage you from giving, but you might consider supporting other families who are having less success in getting support to help pay for burying their loved ones or dealing with their kinds of stresses. Hey, I wanted to stop right here for a moment because I told you I might have a special guest on. He's actually at the hospital with a loved one, but David Robinson, the father of Daniel Robinson, reached out and asked if I could just ask and invite all of you to consider going to the Daniel Robinson webpage. Please help find Daniel. And there, as you scroll down, you'll see that there is a candlelight vigil that's going to be digital in Daniel's behalf on Thursday. And so please consider just dialing in for a few minutes and taking advantage of that. You can find this information at pleasehelpfinddaniel.com. And there you can support David, who has worked and searched tirelessly for his son for the last couple of years. He has torn apart that desert west of Phoenix, Arizona, looking for Daniel, this incredibly handsome young man who was just starting a new career and disappeared. And I'll tell you, David is an amazing example to me, and I deeply appreciate the relationship that we have forged over the last couple of years. So please consider, as you think about where to maybe help, you might consider even donating toward David's efforts, because he spends every dime in trying to find his son. And what an example he is to all of us. And while you're there on his website, and I'm going to hurry and type in the address here so you all can find it easily. Send him a little note, and there's a contact page in there. Send him a little note and tell him that you came over from Profiling Evil and you have thoughts and prayers in his behalf. What a great man he is. But now let's jump back in. And folks, thank you so much for all you do. I hope that you like this kind of approach rather than the more sensational approach. Now, the next phase in this case is going to be either a preliminary hearing, or if word on the street's correct, a grand jury hearing where the state of Ohio will hope for an indictment to be handed down against this guy. Again, they got a great confession unless they can find a way to get that thrown out. So I suspect it's going to go to grand jury, and it'll probably happen in the next week or so. We're going to continue to watch the court process on this case with Chad Doerman and the murder of his 3 children. Now, I'm sure that much more information is going to roll out in the coming weeks, and I believe that this case is going to move rapidly through the court system. If we see any courtroom broadcasts that we can restream, we're going to certainly do so, and we'll try to chat with you during those court processes. You know, Profiling Evil isn't as sensational as some of the other really cool channels out there on YouTube, but we do try to be educational. And at times we try to be a little bit entertaining. So I hope you're finding our channel useful and that you're hitting that like and subscribe button and that you're giving us a thumbs up. All of that stuff helps us. And I also hope you're sharing us with your friends. We love to grow and we love having your support along the way. So I hope you'll take time to check us out on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and of course here on YouTube. And don't forget to check out Profiling Evil podcasts, where you get these audio versions of some of the things we talk about on YouTube and a whole bunch of things we haven't covered on YouTube. You can find Profiling Evil podcasts on your favorite podcast platform. And don't forget, folks, you can always donate to us through your super chats, through donations online at PayPal, or through our website, profilingevil.com. And make sure you're signing up for our B.O.L.O. That's our digital newsletter. We only send it out a couple of times a year. And since I'm mentioning our webpage, make sure that you're checking us out, and please consider getting one of my signed books. Now, you can also find those same books on Amazon in paperback for a little bit less if you'd like to get them that way. So thanks so much for your support, folks. And we'll see you all soon at the next crime scene.